Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, lovers and seekers, those who are lost and those who are found. Tonight, I will be reading from the compilation titled Outlaw Creative, The Geometry of Life. Tonight's reading will be from the chapter titled On Being the Worst Person in the World. I find this to be quite curious. Regardless, let's get started, shall we? On being the worst person in the world. The phrase sounds like a confession, but it is not one. It sounds like self-loathing, but it is not that either. The worst person in the world is not a psychological diagnosis, nor a moral ranking. It is a position. A place one stands after several other places have been exhausted. Most people imagine the worst person in the world as someone who has done the most damage. That imagination is childish. Damage is measurable only after the fact, and even then poorly. History is full of people who believe themselves righteous while producing ruin, and others who believe themselves failures while quietly preventing catastrophe. Moral accounting is always retrospective and always distorted. The phrase here points somewhere else entirely. It points to the moment when self-improvement collapses as a governing principle. Failure is impossible, not because success has been achieved, but because success has lost its authority. You can't do better than that does not describe an external ceiling. It names the internal disappearance of the imperative to do better. The engine that once drove effort, comparison, expectation, imagined futures, imagined judges, no longer turns. This is not nihilism. Nihilism still cares. It still wants the universe to acknowledge its disappointment. The position being described here is quieter, colder, and more stable. It is the recognition that improvement has been functioning as a moral idol. Improvement is one of the most successful modern religions. It has no priesthood, but it has metrics. It has no scriptures, but it has dashboards. It has no Sabbath, because rest is indistinguishable from failure. Its central sin is stagnation. Its central virtue is momentum. To call oneself the worst person in the world is to step outside that religion without claiming superiority over it. It is not an accusation against others. It is a refusal to keep playing the game. The phrase rough draft matters here. A rough draft implies revision. It implies future polish. But when attached to the worst person in the world, it does something paradoxical. It empties revision of urgency. The draft is rough not because refinement is coming, but because refinement no longer governs worth. This is where many readers panic. They hear irresponsibility, they hear abdication, they hear danger. But that reaction reveals how deeply improvement has colonized moral imagination. The fear is not that things will get worse. The fear is that nothing will compel them to get better. That fear assumes compulsion is the only source of goodness. But compulsion has always been a blunt instrument. It produces motion, not wisdom. It produces compliance, not discernment. It produces anxiety far more reliably than it produces care. When the fragment says, no matter how hard, you don't try, even once, it is not celebrating sloth. It is identifying the end of performative effort. Trying hard is often the loudest way people avoid seeing clearly. Hard trying can be a shield against attention. It can substitute exertion for honesty. In this sense, the worst person in the world is not the one who has failed most spectacularly, but the one who has stopped using failure as a prod. Failure no longer instructs, success no longer seduces. The entire feedback loop has lost voltage. This is terrifying to systems built on incentives. It is liberating to bodies that have been whipped by them. There is a theological resonance here, whether acknowledged or not. Grace without progress is an old scandal. It offended moralists long before it offended productivity culture. The idea that worth could be real without assent has always sounded like an invitation to chaos. But chaos does not usually follow. Something stranger does. Attention returns. Without the constant demand to become better, the present stops being merely a staging area for a superior future. The person no longer stands in their own life like a disappointed supervisor. They become, instead, a witness, sometimes bored, sometimes curious, sometimes tender, sometimes exhausted, but no longer adjudicating every moment against an imagined ideal. The phrase, "this is as good as it gets," is usually read as despair, but despair is loud. Despair argues. Despair wants witnesses. This line is flat, almost administrative. It reads less like grief and more like acceptance of a boundary condition. Physics again helps here. When a system reaches equilibrium, it does not collapse. It stabilizes. Energy still moves, but without the violent gradients that once drove it. The worst person in the world is not a person at rock bottom. It is a person at moral equilibrium. Nothing needs to be proven. Nothing needs to be redeemed. Nothing needs to be explained. That is not heroism. It is not sainthood. It is not wisdom. It is simply what remains when self-justification finally runs out of fuel. And from there, oddly enough, life continues. Not upward, not downward, just on.